Have you ever wondered why so many combat veterans, men trained to face the worst horrors of war, come home only to completely avoid the forests that were once their sanctuary? What could scare soldiers who survived the most brutal battlefields in the modern world? For decades, whispered accounts have circulated among military communities, stories of encounters that defy not only logic, but our very understanding of what inhabits North America's most remote regions. These aren't bar tales or post-traumatic fantasies. They are testimonies from men whose credibility was forged in the fire of combat, whose words carry the weight of extreme experience. What if ancient texts were right? What if the biblical descriptions of the Nephilim, the giants who inhabited the earth in those days, weren't just metaphors or myths, but historical records of a reality that persisted through millennia? Is it possible that in the unexplored depths of American forests, echoes of these antediluvian beings still walk among the shadows? This investigation reconstructs two documented encounters that force us to question not only our understanding of North American fauna, but perhaps our very position in the hierarchy of predators. Through the accounts of Brian, an Iraq War Marine veteran, and Mark, a soldier from the Tennessee mountains, we explore events that transcend conventional military experience and lead us into territories where faith, science, and the unexplainable intertwine in a disturbing way. The high desert mountains of California held secrets Brian never imagined during his youth. He grew up in that border region where the arid desert began its gradual transformation into sparse forest, a land of transition that shaped his soul as much as the Iraqi battlefields shaped his combat perspective. The Marine returned from his first tour in Iraq, carrying more than just war memories. There was something in the combat experience that sharpened his instincts in an almost supernatural way, a heightened perception that made every sound of the forest echo with potential meaning. For years exploring those valleys and canyons, Brian developed an intimacy with the territory that bordered on the mystical. He knew every trail, every rock formation, every behavior of the local wildlife. It was like walking into my own living room, he would later recall, trying to explain the visceral familiarity he felt with those lands. But on that night off duty, something had changed in the ancient equation between man and nature. The coyote hunt had begun as a routine mission. Local ranchers reported increasing attacks on livestock, and Brian, along with his fellow Marine nicknamed Boot, due to his recent graduation, had volunteered to solve the problem. Both were experienced hunters, veterans not only of modern wars, but of the oldest war, the perpetual struggle between civilization and savagery. Twilight had painted the mountains in orange hues when they first heard the calls. The characteristic howls of coyotes echoed through the canyons, but there was something subtly unsettling about those sounds. Brian paused, his hand instinctively moving to his .308 rifle as his military senses went on alert. "Are you feeling that too?" Boot asked, his voice carrying a tension he couldn't hide. Years of combat had taught both of them to trust their instincts. When something didn't feel right, it usually wasn't. The coyotes' calls continued, but they followed a pattern that didn't match the pack's natural behavior. It was as if they were being orchestrated. "Maybe they've changed their tactics since our last hunt," Brian muttered, trying to rationalize the growing discomfort he felt in his stomach. But even as he spoke the words, he knew something deeper was wrong. They advanced cautiously through the sparse vegetation, following the sounds that seemed to lead them deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The crescent moon provided enough light for navigation, but also created deceptive shadows that transformed every bush into a potential threat. It was the injured pup calls that finally alerted them to the true nature of their situation. Any experienced predator knew this tactic, feigning vulnerability to lure unsuspecting prey. But as Brian and Boot approached what they believed to be the coyote den 25 yards away, a shocking realization hit them simultaneously. There were no coyotes. The silence that followed was absolute, loaded with a tension that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Brian felt all his combat instincts activating simultaneously, the same sensation he had experienced moments before an ambush in Fallujah. Without needing verbal communication, both Marines retreated to defensive positions, their weapons ready. It was then that they began to wait. In the growing darkness, surrounded by the low-lying trees, two war veterans prepared to face something that would challenge not only their lives, but their fundamental understanding of reality. Time seemed distorted in that silent vigil. Brian would later estimate they waited less than an hour, but each minute stretched like an eternity. It was Boot who first broke the silence, using Brian's last name, a military habit that seemed incongruous in that familiar environment, but carried the gravity of the moment. "Movement," Boot whispered, his voice just a thread of sound in the night air. What emerged from the trees defied all previous experience for both men. It was vaguely humanoid, but its stature transcended any normal human proportion. The creature moved with a fluidity that suggested intelligence, yet its presence emanated something primitive and menacing that made every animal instinct of the Marines scream in alarm. Brian raised his .308 rifle, aligning the scope with the figure's center mass. Years of military training and real combat converged in that moment. When he pulled the trigger, the roar of the shot echoed through the canyons like thunder. But the creature didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Boot fired his .30-06 in rapid succession, the sounds of the shots creating a cacophony that should have alerted all wildlife in the area. But the creature kept walking, seemingly immune to the projectiles that should have been fatal. "Battle mode," Brian would later recall. "We went into full battle mode." Both continued firing, their weapons spitting fire and metal in a desperate attempt to stop something that seemed to transcend the laws of physics. Military training took over. Reload, aim, fire, reload. But with each shot that failed to bring the creature down, a terrible realization crystallized. They were facing something their conventional weapons couldn't stop. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It turned perpendicular to the shooter's position and began to walk, disappearing into the darkness of the forest with the same disturbing fluidity with which it had arrived. The silence that followed was different from before. It was loaded not only with tension, but with a fundamental and terrifying understanding. They had been hunted. The creature knew them, knew their methods, and had deliberately led them far from any familiar territory. It was only a week later that they discovered the true coyote den, 10 miles in the opposite direction, on the other side of town. The implication was disturbing. The creature had studied their hunting patterns, had perfectly imitated the sounds of a coyote pack, and had even left false evidence, scat and urine from different members of a non-existent pack, to complete the illusion. As Brian would observe years later, while still avoiding those mountains he once called home, that night, for the first time in our lives, we were the hunted. The question that remained, echoing through the subsequent years, was fundamental. What possessed the intelligence to orchestrate such an ambush, the physical resilience to ignore multiple shots from high-powered rifles, and the terrifying presence to turn two experienced combat veterans into prey? Walden's Ridge stretched like an ancient scar across eastern Tennessee, guarding secrets as old as the mountains themselves. Mark, a military veteran, would discover that some childhood legends were more than folklore when he faced the unexplainable on the rocky cliffs in 1989. In 1976, at age 12, Mark rode his minibike down a forgotten road, two parallel ruts left by wagon wheels, perhaps from the last century. As he emerged from the trail, an old woman called him from her porch with the authority of someone who had lived generations observing the mountains. "Boy, you should never go through there," she said, gripping his arm with a strength that conveyed absolute seriousness. "There's a reason they blocked that road." The story she told transported Mark to the early 20th century, when two families, the Smiths and the Browns, lived on opposite sides of the valley. One fateful night, after a social gathering that extended past midnight, the Brown brothers saddled their horses to return across the dark valley. At the creek at the bottom of the valley, under a large rock, came the first whistle, seemingly a normal night bird. but the horses reacted as if they heard death. 4 horses bolted in a panic. Only the youngest brother was thrown to the ground when his horse reared in terror. What he saw when he looked up defied all experience, 2 red eyes glowing from the top of the rock. When the creature whistled again, it jumped with impossible agility for something of its size. The attack on the horse was brutal. The young man emptied his .45 into the creature. Six shots in quick succession, but the projectiles only angered it. When they returned at dawn with reinforcements, they found something even more disturbing. The horse had completely disappeared along with all its tack. The sand had been swept clean, as if pine branches had systematically erased all evidence. There was only the blood mixed in the sand, the woman said. Something with the intelligence to clean the scene, but which chose to leave precisely the evidence that would ensure the story was told. Mark absorbed this story with the seriousness of the mountains, promising never to use that road, a promise kept for 13 years. When he returned from the military in 1989 at 25, Mark carried the invisible scars common to veterans: a failed marriage, post-service depression, and a restlessness that only the forests calmed. He sought solace in a grove of ancient pines on the west side of the mountain, where massive trees created a natural cathedral of tranquility. On that night in 1989, he allowed serenity to distract him from basic prudence. He spent hours walking the base of the cliffs with his Winchester Model 97, more out of habit than necessity. Around midnight, sitting overlooking the valley, savoring bourbon while contemplating the distant lights of civilization, he heard the first Bob White. For seconds it seemed normal. Then the chilling realization: Bob White's a quail and quail are not nocturnal. When a second one responded from a different direction, Mark knew he was being hunted. The old woman's story returned with crystal clarity. The whistling jack was not folklore, but a warning based on real encounters. The false calls continued, approaching coordinately, demonstrating intelligence and planning. Mark quickly packed up and climbed to the cliffs, fixing a flashlight under the shotgun barrel with electrical tape. He could hear heavy footsteps trying to mirror his movements, a technique that demonstrated not only intelligence, but specific knowledge of human behavior. His intimate knowledge of the mountains became his salvation. He knew a crack in the cliff face, the only climbing route for miles of vertical escarpments. It was a geological work of millennia, narrow at the base, widening to form an opening just wide enough for a man to pass. On the other side, a natural ledge allowed precarious access to the top. He pushed his backpack and weapon ahead, crawling along the ledge with his heart pounding. He heard movements at the base of the cliff. Something was exploring the entrance but didn't follow him. Reaching the top, he ran to the pine grove, positioning himself against a massive tree. Then he heard the footsteps again. "I have no idea to this day how they got to the top so quickly," he would admit decades later. That crack was the only way up, but there they were. The creatures began to circle the grove, staying in the dense vegetation where his light couldn't reach. It was a demonstration of tactical intelligence that chilled his blood. They were looking for an approach with maximum advantage. When they completed the circle, they positioned themselves to cut off any retreat. I shot twice in the direction I believed they were in. The scream that followed was not of pain, but of rage, the sound of a predator challenged in its own territory. Then, as abruptly the encounter ended, he heard the creatures moving away, heavy footsteps fading until only silence remained. He remained in position until dawn, every muscle tense. When the first light penetrated the canopy, he ran. "In 28 years, I've never set foot in those woods again," he would confess decades later. He moved to Alabama a few months later, staying 25 years until returning to Tennessee in 2015. Even then, he never ventured into the forest alone again. carrying the certainty of having faced something that defies conventional scientific understanding. There's a disturbing pattern that emerges when we examine Brian's and Mark's accounts through the lens of ancient history and modern military experience. Both men, forged in the fire of contemporary combat, found themselves face to face with something that seemed to transcend not only their tactical understanding, but the very limits of physical reality as we know it. When Brian fired multiple .308 rounds, ammunition capable of dropping a grizzly bear with a single well-placed shot, and observed the creature continue walking impassively, as if immune to the projectiles, he wasn't just facing an unknown animal. He was confronting something that defied the fundamental laws of ballistics and physiology he had learned both in training and on the battlefields of Iraq. Similarly, when Mark heard the impossible footsteps echoing on top of the cliff, knowing that narrow crack was the only possible access route, he wasn't simply being pursued by a wild predator. He was being hunted by something that possessed capabilities that transcended normal human understanding of physics and anatomy. What's perhaps most unsettling in both accounts is the consistent demonstration of superior intelligence and strategic planning by the creatures. We're not talking about animal instinct, but something that approaches human rationality, or perhaps surpasses it. The creature Brian faced had meticulously studied the two Marines' hunting patterns. It knew how to imitate not only the sounds of coyotes, but the specific behaviors of a pack in hunting territories. More disturbing still, it had planted false physical evidence, scat and urine from different members of a non-existent pack, to complete an illusion that led two experienced hunters 10 miles in the wrong direction. This is not animal behavior, this is psychological warfare. The creatures that pursued Mark demonstrated even more sophisticated capabilities. They not only mimicked bird calls with enough precision to deceive someone raised in the forests, but coordinated their movements tactically, using long-distance communication to execute a complex ambush. When Mark took refuge in the pine grove, they assessed his defensive position, identified his possible escape routes, and systematically blocked them. Again, this transcends instinct. This is military strategy. This is where contemporary accounts begin to echo disturbingly with much older texts. The book of Genesis, in chapter 6, speaks of the Nephilim, literally the fallen ones in Hebrew, described as giants who were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The word Gibborim, translated as mighty men or powerful, carries connotations of supernatural strength and prowess in combat that transcends normal human capabilities. These weren't simply big men, they were beings whose very existence represented an aberration of the created natural order. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 32 offers an even more specific description. They do not lie with the mighty warriors who are fallen of the uncircumcised, who have gone down to Sheol with their weapons of war, and whose swords are laid under their heads, and their iniquities are upon their bones. For they were the terror of the mighty in the land of the living. The terror of the mighty in the land of the living. This phrase resonates powerfully when we consider two combat veterans, men literally trained to be mighty in the land of the living, reduced to absolute terror by encounters that challenged everything they knew about combat and survival. The Book of Numbers provides another intriguing point of reference. When the Israelite spies returned from Canaan, they reported, "There we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight like grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." The sensation of being reduced to a grasshopper before something vastly superior echoes through the centuries to Brian's and Mark's accounts. Both men, despite all their military training and combat experience, felt fundamentally diminished and vulnerable before the creatures they encountered. More significantly, the reference to the sons of Anak suggests lineage, a genetic continuity that persisted through generations. If the biblical accounts are historically accurate, then the presence of the Nephilim was not an isolated event in ancient times, but a continuous reality that may have found ways to survive the great cataclysms of human history. The Appalachian Mountains, where Mark had his encounter, are some of the oldest geological formations in North America, much older than the Rockies or the Andes. If a population of pre-Diluvian beings managed to survive the great cataclysms described in ancient scriptures, deep cave systems in these ancient mountains would offer ideal refuges. Mark himself noted the correlation between cave systems and human disappearances in the American mountains. Overlaying maps reveals an alarming correspondence between areas of high cave density and locations where people disappear without a trace. Is it possible that these underground networks serve as habitat for descendants of the antediluvian giants? The physical characteristics described in the encounters, exceptional stature, seemingly supernatural strength, resistance to firearms, superior intelligence, correspond remarkably to the biblical descriptions of the Nephilim. More importantly, both groups seem to share a crucial characteristic. They inspire a terror that goes beyond the normal fear of animal predators. There's something in Brian's and Mark's accounts that transcends normal physical fear. Both describe a particular quality of terror that seemed to penetrate to their very bones, a sensation that went beyond rational concern for physical safety and touched something deeper in the human psyche. In Scripture, encounters with supernatural beings often produce this same quality of absolute terror. When the prophet Daniel saw heavenly visions, he described how his strength completely left him and his face lost its color. When the shepherds encountered the angel in the field of Bethlehem, the fear was so intense that divine intervention was needed just to calm them enough to receive the message. There is a particular quality to supernatural terror that is distinct from natural fear. It's as if the human soul instinctively recognizes that it is in the presence of something that should not exist, something that violates the natural orders established in creation. If we accept the possibility that Brian's and Mark's encounters represent genuine contact with descendants of the antediluvian beings described in Scripture, then we are forced to fundamentally reconsider our understanding of both history and contemporary reality. The Bible may be far more historically literal than many modern scholars assume. The descriptions of the Nephilim may not be allegorical or mythological, but accurate records of real events and beings that coexisted with early humanity. The survival of such beings through millennia suggests that large portions of our planet remain truly unexplored and unknown. If populations of antediluvian giants have persisted in remote regions, then our understanding of terrestrial biodiversity is profoundly incomplete. The hierarchy of predators may be very different from what we assume. Two combat veteran Marines, representatives of the pinnacle of human military training, were easily outmatched and forced to flee by beings that operated with capabilities that transcend normal human physical limitations. What lends particular credibility to Brian's and Mark's accounts is precisely their military training. These are not easily impressionable civilians or individuals with fantastical tendencies. They are men trained for precise observation under extreme stress, men whose survival depended on rapid and accurate threat assessments in hostile environments. When an Iraq War Marine veteran says he fired multiple 308 rounds into a creature that continued walking impassively, we are not hearing fantasy or exaggeration. We are hearing the testimony of someone trained to deliver precise and lethal fire under extreme pressure, someone who knows exactly what his weapons can and should do against living targets. When a Tennessee Mountain veteran describes being hunted by creatures that demonstrated sophisticated tactical capabilities, we are not hearing paranoia or imagination. We are hearing the account of someone who has spent his entire life navigating wild environments and who recognizes the difference between normal animal behavior and something far more complex and threatening. The pattern that emerges when we place these modern accounts alongside ancient texts is profoundly disturbing. We have consistent descriptions of beings of exceptional stature, supernatural strength, superior intelligence, and a terrifying presence that transcends normal animal fear. We have geographical indications that such beings prefer remote mountainous regions, precisely the types of territories that would offer maximum refuge from the expansion of human civilization throughout the millennia. We have behavioral evidence that these beings are not simply large animals, but possess cognitive capabilities that equal or exceed human ones, particularly in the areas of strategic planning and psychological warfare. And we have the testimony of men whose credibility was forged in the furnaces of extreme military experience. Men who risked their reputations and peace of mind to record encounters that defy conventional understanding. As we close this investigation into the antediluvian echoes that may still walk among the shadows of American forests, we are confronted with a question that transcends academic curiosity and touches the very core of our understanding of reality. Could Bigfoot be a remaining descendant of the antediluvian beings of enormous stature described in the Bible and other ancient books? The evidence presented through Brian's and Mark's accounts suggests that this possibility deserves serious consideration. The correspondences between the biblical descriptions of the Nephilim and the characteristics observed in modern encounters are too numerous to be simply coincidental. Exceptional stature that inspires primal terror, strength that transcends known physical limitations, intelligence that equals or surpasses human capabilities, resistance to weapons that should be lethal, capacity for sophisticated tactical coordination, preference for remote mountainous regions that would offer refuge from human expansion. More significantly, both groups, the biblical Nephilim and the creatures from modern encounters, share the ability to inspire a specific type of terror that goes beyond normal physical fear. It's as if the human soul instinctively recognizes that it is in the presence of something that should not exist according to the established natural order. If this interpretation is correct, then Brian's and Mark's encounters represent much more than sightings of unknown cryptids. They represent windows into a reality that directly connects with the oldest and most significant events in recorded human history. The implications are profound. If descendants of the antediluvian giants have persisted through millennia in the most remote regions of Earth, then our understanding of both biblical history and contemporary biodiversity requires fundamental revision. For those who view the Bible as a literal historical record, these encounters offer tangible validation of events that many have relegated to the realm of mythology. For those who approach these issues from a secular scientific perspective, the accounts present anomalies that challenge established paradigms about evolution, species distribution, and the limits of human knowledge about our own planet. Perhaps most importantly, Brian's and Mark's accounts remind us that despite all our technological and military advancements, there are still forces in this world that can reduce even our most highly trained warriors to the state of vulnerable prey. At a time when humanity often considers itself the apex of the global food chain, these encounters suggest that our position may be far less secure than we assume. The antediluvian echoes may still walk among us, preserved in the depths of Earth's oldest mountains, reminding us that there is much more between heaven and earth than our philosophy can dream of. And perhaps, in the whispered words of veterans who never returned to the forests they once called home, we can hear the echoes of a truth that connects our modern world with the deepest mysteries of antiquity. The question remains open, echoing through the mountains and through time. When we look into the shadows of America's most remote forests, are we catching a glimpse of descendants of the giants who once walked with the first children of Adam? The testimonies are recorded. The evidence has been presented. The answer, like so many profound truths, may lie at the intersection of faith, experience, and the humility to recognize that not everything that is real easily fits into our established categories of understanding.